Hey Sugar Geeks, Liz here. Today we are going to be making sourdough starter. And by today, I mean this week, because I'm going to be taking you through 7 days of making starter, taking care of it every day, what to expect, what's normal, what's not normal, and all that good stuff. So let's get started. So if you want to make sourdough bread, then you need to make some sourdough starter. Sourdough starter is basically yeast. If you've ever made bread before, you've probably used active yeast or instant dried yeast. This is basically a freeze-dried, processed, commercialized version of yeast. But what if you can't find any yeast, or you want your bread to just be risen naturally? Natural yeast tastes different than regular yeast, mostly because it takes longer for it to actually rise. And when it takes more time to rise, that gives yeast more time to work, and that causes that sour flavor. So the way that we make starter is we take some flour. It doesn't really matter what kind, as long as it's unbleached. Natural things do not like bleach. So you need unbleached flour. All the yeast that we need is already in this flour, but there's not very much in here. So what we're gonna do is we're going to add water to this flour, give it some warmth, give it some time, and it's going to turn into something we call a sourdough starter. And once you make your sourdough starter, it will last you forever. There's some people who say that their sourdough starter is 100 years old. It was brought over on the Mayflower. You know, it's been used in an Italian bakery for the last 100 years. So it could be true, because all you have to do is just give it a little more flour and water and it will last forever. So let's go ahead and get started with the process of making our starter. What do we need to make our little starter? You need like a little container, nice tall 4-cup container. I got this one from IKEA and I love it because it has nice straight sides. It already has lines built in, so it's really easy to see how much your starter has grown. Preferably glass for starting, because it's really easy to sanitize this. We are using whole wheat flour to start our starter. Make sure you have your PDF printed out and follow along. Make note of everything you're using, because you might think, oh, I'll remember what I did, but you won't. You will not remember as days go by. So just make notes every day of what you did and what's working and what's not working. So we have our sterilized container. We know what flour to use. The next thing we need to use is water. This jug of water costs $1, so it was worth the investment. You can use filtered water if you happen to have like a filter on your house faucet or on your fridge, but it needs to be warm. So I just have this bottle of water sitting aside, and then I microwave it in the microwave for like 10 seconds, because you want it to be about 90 degrees. That's going to help the yeast start growing. Let's talk about yeast. Yeast is in flour already. There's not a ton of yeast though. So it's not like you can just take flour and like put water on it and then have all the yeast you need. You need to make it stronger, which is a term that always confused me. Like, are we making the yeast like work out? Is it getting buffer? No, by stronger, we mean we're making it multiply. And the yeast that's in the flour will start eating the sugars and the starches in the flour, and it produces gas, bubbles and stuff. Warm spots. Top of your fridge is a good spot. On top of your oven with the light on is a good spot. Inside your oven with the light on, the oven is not on, but just like the light on is a good spot. You can also take like a little pot of boiling water. This is like what yeast loves. Pot of boiling water into the oven, and you create a warm, steamy environment, and boy, oh boy, does it love that. So that's a great way to get your yeast going. Okay, so let's make some sourdough starter already. Geez, Liz. So on day one, I'm actually going to make my starter in a bowl at first, and then transfer it to the container because it's a little bit less messy. So we're starting out with 150 grams of whole wheat flour and 150 grams of bottled filtered water. Barely warm. 87 degrees. We're gonna call that good. I'm gonna wash my hands because we're gonna mix this with our hands. You only have to do that the first time. After that, you can mix with like a wooden spoon. You can't use metal because yeast is extremely acidic. So it will eat away at the metal and it will eat away at the spoon, and then you will leach metals into your yeast. That is not good. You don't want that. So don't use anything metal. It's okay to cook on something metal, but don't store it in something metal. All right, this goes into this, and then we smush it with our hands. What you're trying to do when you mix water into flour is you are trying to remove all signs of dry flour. So that's really the only goal. You're not trying to knead, you're not trying to get any sort of specific consistency, just trying to get rid of all the flour. And your hand is a great way to do this because you pick it up and you squish it between your fingers. And if that grosses you out, I'm sorry, but it's a great way to just get rid of all of the flour. Okay, so we're gonna take this, put it into our container, and then at first it's gonna just look really lumpy, but as it relaxes, it'll start to kind of spread out, and then you can really see about where it is. So, container with lines is awesome. Just lightly cover so that no gas builds up and doesn't create any pressure or anything like that, and it can expand and contract as needed. This is gonna go in a warm spot. I'm gonna put it up here on top of my fridge. So we've made our starter. It's sitting in its warm environment. That's ingredient number 3. And then we're going to give it some time. That's ingredient number 4. And we're gonna come back tomorrow and see where we're at. So on day 2, we're gonna remove half of this and add back in 75 grams of flour and 75 grams of water. So I can see a few little bubbles on the side. It has not risen at all. That's normal. Like, that's just what it does on day 1. Temperature of the room today, it is 70 degrees. So that's good. It smells like wheat flour. Doesn't have any sort of smell really. So this is at the 300 milliliter line. I'm just gonna remove starter until I have about 150 milliliters. Ooh. If you have like water on top or anything like that, just stir it back in. It's normal. It's okay. Okay, so this, not good to eat, just throw it away. All right, 75 grams. I'm using a scale because it makes it very easy. Mix that all up. The goal is to just get rid of all the dry flour. Cover it back up. Done. Hello, Sugar Geeks. It is day 3 of sourdough feeding. We have our starter here. It has risen quite a bit from the last time we checked after 24 hours. Ooh, smells very stinky. My starter rose to, looks like the highest mark was the 500 milliliters. So I would say this is a medium amount of activity. That's pretty good. Lots of bubbles. If you have any sort of like water or anything like that on top, you can go ahead and remove that. This is what it looks like. Definitely smells funky. All right, I'm gonna say that's about half. You can definitely eyeball this part. There's your food buddy. There's your water. Mix it all up until we don't see any flour. Cover her back up, put her back to bed, and we will see you again in 24 hours. It looks like mine just pretty much about doubled. There's definitely more bubbles in here. I see more, like bigger bubbles. It's a little bit more of a sour smell starting to develop. It's not all just funky feet. It's pretty warm in the kitchen. Ooh, yep, still stinky for sure. You could just eyeball half, but I'm gonna start measuring. Your starter is a lot looser now, right? Looks more liquidy instead of kind of like this solid hunk that it was before. It's a lot easier. That's just a sign that the yeast is more active and it's breaking down that gluten, that starch, a lot more than it was before. So I'm gonna put about half back in there. Should be around 150 grams. Now I'm gonna add in 75 grams. I'm using just the whole wheat flour, and 75 grams bottled water. And I'm not warming my bottled water up because it's warm in my house and I don't need to. If you were not seeing any activity and your starter's not growing, it's having a hard time, you could start with warm bottled water like we were before. Or you could just put it back in that warm spot. Okay, our baby is now fed and watered. Back over here, your spot. I'm gonna change this to day 4. And I will see you guys tomorrow, and we will start switching our flour from whole wheat to all-purpose. All right, exciting things are happening today. It's day 5. You guys have been diligently feeding your starter. You're getting emotionally attached to her by now. I'm sure, I know that I was. The only way that your starter would be dead or not worth saving is if it had mold growing in there. That's the only time we would actually throw this away. Or if you accidentally turned on the oven and made bread out of your starter, then it's definitely dead. So that is the only reason why you should stop. So everything else is normal. I can tell that this guy got all the way up to the 20 mark. So it tripled in size because I can just see the line where it reached its peak and then it has sunk back down. I also have my cast iron pan heating up over here because I'm going to bake this leftover starter. All right, I'm gonna mix you all up. Starting to smell a little bit more tangy to me. You can see it's very loose, very watery, because the yeast is doing a good job of breaking down all that starch, that gluten. I'm gonna take some of this out, guesstimating about how much should be left. If I had all-purpose unbleached flour, that is what I would use, but I don't have that. I only have bread flour, so that's what I'm gonna use. So in goes the 75 grams, and I'm gonna do 75 grams of the bottled water, room temperature. Make sure you get all that flour mixed in. Scrape down the sides so that you can see how much your starter grows. Today we will start feeding twice a day for the next 2 days because our starter has multiplied enough that it can start handling more food, and we want it to just get stronger. So set an alarm for 12 hours from now. So for me, that's going to be 9 o'clock. And we're going to feed this a second time, the exact same way that we're doing right now. Just removing half, feeding 75 grams, unbleached, all-purpose flour or bread flour. The reason why we're switching is because we want to start slowing it down as far as how fast it's eating, but feed it more often. So it will eat through all-purpose flour or bread flour slower than it eats through wheat flour. On day 6, we're gonna go ahead and do the same thing, replacing half of our starter, this time with the unbleached flour, some bottled water that's warm to 90 degrees, Give it a mix until no dry flour remains, and then go ahead and put it back in its nice warm spot. 12 hours later, we're going to repeat this exact same process. You should be seeing more activity by this point. If you're not, just continue feeding until you do. All right, it is day 7. Congratulations, you have made it through the week. Your starter should start looking a little bit more bubbly. It should smell kind of sweet and tangy and not like old socks. You'll notice that it's a lot thinner. That's because the yeast is doing its job and breaking down all that starch and gluten and turning it into sugar alcohols and gas. Once your starter is doubling in size, then you can go ahead and see if it's ready to start making some bread. In a lot of sourdough bread recipes, you will often see something called a levain. They'll say, make your levain. Levain is a confusing word for myself and a lot of people because it's unclear what really levain is. Really, levain is the French word for starter. But why can't you just take your starter and then put that into dough and make bread? Well, some people do that, and that's definitely something you can do, but for beginners, it's easier to understand starter as its own thing and levain as its own thing. So if I were to take my starter on day 7 and it's very hungry, it's very low in the jar, it's not doing much of anything, and I tried to make bread, it might take it a while to get active and really start going. So what's recommended is that you use starter at the point of its most active or when it's reached its peak. Peaking is basically your starter eats food, it rises, it runs out of food, and then it starts falling. So that point where it has reached its highest point in the jar is the peak. So when it's reached its peak, it has multiplied a ton, it's very strong and active, and that's the best time to use it because you have a lot of yeast in the flour. If you try to use your starter when it's not active and not at its peak, it'll definitely work, but it's going to take a while for it to multiply enough to make your bread rise. So we make something called a levain. So we're going to take our starter, we're going to take out half, feed the starter, put that away, and then we're going to take some of that discard, 50 grams, and we're going to combine it with 50 grams of whole wheat flour, 50 grams of warm water, and we're going to put it in a nice warm spot. And then we're going to let it rise. And if it doubles within 5 hours, you can go ahead and use it to make bread. If it doesn't double in 5 hours, that's okay. It just means that we haven't created enough yeast yet in our starter for it to be strong enough to give rise to a loaf of bread. So just repeat this process for another day. Give it another test with the 50 grams of flour, water, and starter, and see if it doubles within 5 hours. Mine triples in 2 hours. So it just gives you an idea of what you can be shooting for. So for me, it's easy to understand that starter is its own thing. It's kind of like the garden that we harvest yeast from. Levain is the starter that we grow and then use at its peak or its most active point. So now that you've made your starter and it's super bubbly and active, you can leave her on the countertop and use her every couple of days to make bread. You can put her in the fridge if you only want to bake maybe once a week or once a month. Just throw some flour and water in there once a week or so and give her some food. You always have to take out half of your starter whenever you feed it. Otherwise, you will just continually building up more and more and more starter, and then you have to feed it more and more and more flour. So the reason we discard is so that you can keep your starter in a very small amount, in a controlled amount that is reasonable to keep alive, so that we continue using it to make bread without having gallons of starter in our refrigerator, which we have to feed and keep alive. After day 7, you can also transfer your starter into a clean jar and give it a name. I mean, why wouldn't you? You have spent all this time raising it from a wee baby, and now it's a big, strong jar of starter. I named mine Wilda Yeast. I don't know why, it just popped into my head. Like wild yeast, wildebeest. I continue to feed my starter bottled water because I have it. You can use tap water now if you want to, as long as it's not super chlorinated. It's just gonna, get in the way of your yeast growing. Or you can use filtered water, just make sure you warm it up. Some fun things to know if you absolutely don't want to mess with your starter for a long time, maybe you're going on vacation or something, or you're just sick of sourdough for some reason, you can spread it out on some parchment paper and let it completely dry out, crumple it up like some little yeasty crackers, put it in a Ziploc bag and put it in the freezer, and basically put your starter in a deep freeze nap until you need it again. Obviously you'd have to rehydrate and feed a few times to get it active again, but it's kind of a nice way to just say goodnight to your starter for a little while. Chefs have told me though that they have put their yeast in the fridge and not fed it for up to a month and still were able to get their starter back. Seems a little risky, but it just goes to show you that it's really, really, really hard to kill your yeast once you've got it going. So that's it. That's everything you need to know on how to make your very own active and bubbling sourdough starter from scratch in only 5 to 7 days. Hopefully this tutorial has taught you a lot about making your own starter, and now you're ready to make your own sourdough bread. If you want to see more recipes like this one, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I'm Liz Merrick, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.